Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best indie podcasts.
Hello, hello. I'm Courtney, and this is The Book of the Dead, a true crime podcast based out of New Jersey. For those looking for a podcast that focuses on the victims and who they were, or cases where the family is directly involved in the telling of their loved ones' stories, each chapter of this podcast is dedicated to the victim they feature. Here, you can find cases you may have never heard of, or interviews with experts that have dedicated their lives to protect and serve, and occasionally hear from the victim themselves. So get comfortable, grab a drink, and settle in for another chapter of the Book of the Dead.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host, Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey everybody, wow, it has been 5 months since I've recorded. That is crazy. It's just been crazy. Too much work. My boss was on maternity leave for a really long time, which is awesome for her. Like, everybody should get a whole year off, I think. Obviously, I would think something like that. So while I fully support it, it made my life really hard in terms of having extra time for things like recording my podcast. But she's back now, and I've just decided that I'm going to have to find the time no matter what. If that means missing other things, reprioritizing, that's what it's going to have to be, because I'm sick of not recording. And I've had enough people reach out and ask me if I'm going to make more episodes that I feel like this is something that people actually enjoy listening to, which is insanely flattering and super, super cool. And yes, I am going to record, and I'm recording right now. So here we go. I'm actually going to do a case that I started researching, I think back in like December, and I just never finished it because I just kind of ran out of time to do this stuff. But what's really interesting is that there's been an update in the case since I started my research. And so it's kind of cool. I get to sort of like close the loop on the case a little bit more than I would have had I actually recorded this when I intended to. So, there's our silver lining for me being gone for so long. Did I say this is True Crime California? I'm Cindy. This is True Crime California. The world is on fire. Everything sucks. But at least I'm finding time to do this. So there you go. I'm actually going to cover the case of Betty Broderick. This is a very well-known case in California. If you're like a big true crime person, if you're not, you've probably still heard of it. It's one of those ones that kind of everybody knows about. And there were a lot of like social implications to this case. It became famous for, in my opinion, kind of the wrong reasons. And I think it's a big part of why it's so famous is because of the way that Betty was seen after everything that happened. And obviously, I'm going to tell you about that. But I did want to just call out that I think the reason that this is such a popular case and so well known is because it was kind of a sign of the times. I don't know. It was just kind of like Betty became every scorned wife kind of thing. And I know I'm jumping the shark a little bit by saying that, but again, it's a pretty popular case. So most people kind of already know where the story's going. And if you don't, I spoiled it a little, but what's wrong with a little spoiler? I love being spoiled. I love knowing the end before it comes. So if you're like me, you're welcome. If you're not, I apologize. Still a really good story. So stick in here with me, and I'm going to just jump into it right now. Okay, let's see. Betty Broderick was born Elizabeth Ann Bisalia in Bronxville, New York in 1947. Now, real quick, Bronxville is not the Bronx. It's not in Manhattan. It's about, I think, like 15 miles north of what we all think of when we think of like New York. There's New York State and New York City. Most people, when they think of New York, they think of the city. This is upstate, just a touch in the state of New York. And in fact, Bronxville is officially considered a village, as it's only about 1 square mile and less has less than 10,000 residents even now. Can you guys tell I'm rusty at recording? I sure can. So anyway, it's a tiny, quiet town, despite its proximity to the big city. And I might be wrong that it's only 15 miles. I'm actually taking that guesstimate. I could have looked it up, but I'm actually just taking it from like what I remember when I drove from Manhattan up into upstate New York. And I remember passing Bronxville like pretty quickly and being like, wow, this is actually very close to the main city. Or, I mean, Manhattan's so big though that like, even when you're still in Manhattan, when you're way, way, way up, it doesn't feel like you're in the city anymore. Anyway, I digress. It doesn't matter. People who are from New York are probably like, yep, I know what you mean. And everybody else is like, why are you still talking about this? So anyway, she was born and raised in a tiny, quiet town, a village, in fact, very near New York City, but definitely not in New York City by any stretch. Betty was the third of 6 kids born to an Irish-American mother and an Italian-American father. Which is funny because my family is Italian and Irish. We have a good amount of German though. But I remember when I read that, it like resonated with me. Like her last name, Bisceglia, it's Bisceglia. My mom's last name was Stramalia. So the Glia is like very, very Italian. I recognized it right away. Anyway, her family was very strict, very traditional. Her mother didn't work. She stayed home to raise the children, and her father, Frank, ran a plastering business with their extended family. Now, Betty later recalled that she was raised to be a housewife, quote, from the day I was born. The family is pretty wealthy, and Betty was treated like a little princess and was for nothing, but also expected to focus on being a little lady, making herself attractive to men, not focusing on a career. It was all about growing up, finding a man to take care of you. So, it's one of those things like she didn't mind her upbringing when it suited her, but when she could use it as an excuse to make her look like a victim, she certainly did so. And you'll kind of see this coming out. So like when she was younger, she probably loved having, being daddy's little girl and having everything she wanted, having money, not being expected to work. Like, yeah, she was going to go to college, but I think it was basically to find a man. But then later on, she used it as if she's like super oppressed by her parents, right? Now, Betty attended Catholic high school, but ultimately graduated from a public school, then went to a Catholic all-women's college in the area. I think going to college, again, like I said, was about meeting a man as much as it was about getting an education, at least in Betty's mind, and it definitely worked out that way for her. Because while in college, Betty and a friend either went to see a football game. I think they went to see a football game and visit a friend at Notre Dame College in Indiana. And I've seen both stories, but I think I remember an interview with her where she kind of said it was both, and it doesn't really matter. What does matter is that while she was there, she met a student named Dan Broderick. Dan Broderick, like Betty, was raised in a strict Catholic household, but unlike Betty, came from a much more working class background. When they met, Dan was a senior in college, 3 years older than Betty, and was about to head to Cornell for medical school, which meant he had big plans for himself, which I'm sure Betty took note of. Now, that being said, when she first met him, she said she wasn't very impressed and talked about how skinny he was and how his glasses made him look like a dork, saying his vibe was, quote, geek city. But I do think in the back of her mind, she was thinking medical school. And I just have that feeling. And I think as we get to know her a little bit more, you will come to agree with that feeling of mine. I also want to call out that whatever Betty said to make it sound like she wasn't interested, Dan was a really good looking man. And like even in high school, or not high school, but college with his big dorky glasses, like he was like Clark Kent. Okay. Like he, it's like a movie star where they try to make him look dorky by putting glasses on him and then they take him off. And that's all it takes for there to be this great transformation. Yeah, that's Dan Broderick. Anyway, they met, and like I said, Betty wasn't impressed, but Dan sure was. Now, for as handsome as Dan was, Betty was also very beautiful. She was tall, she was blonde, she had a great smile, and Dan fell hard. Now, after Betty went back to her home in her college, Dan wrote her letters multiple times a week and basically just pursued her until she could no longer resist him. Finally, after several months, the two began dating, and after just a few years, they were married in a small ceremony in New York in 1969, and when they returned from their honeymoon, Betty was already pregnant with their first daughter, Kim. So, whether or not her assertion that she was basically trained to be a housewife is true, it certainly worked out that way for her and pretty darn quickly. Now, that being said, it definitely wasn't all fun and games for Betty, and her lifestyle had to change quite a bit in the beginning of their marriage. I said they got married quickly. She became pregnant immediately. This meant that Dan was still in medical school when they were married, and he was so busy in school that he wasn't able to work. So Betty, planning on being a housewife, instead had to take all sorts of odd jobs to support their ever-growing family. And when I say ever-growing, what I mean is Kim was born in 1970, quickly followed by Lee, born in 1971, Daniel Broderick IV, born in 1976, and later on Rhett, born in 1979. So they had 4 kids over 9 years, but those first 2 years were back to back, and also while Dan wasn't able to work. Because Betty had a small child and another on the way, during the time Dan was in school, she had to take on jobs as a babysitter or nanny so she could take her kids with her or be pregnant while she worked. She also resorted to selling Tupperware and Avon, which didn't have the same connotations it does now with all the MLM out there nowadays, but it was still not something she probably ever saw herself doing, and probably felt a little degraded by having to do that. Times were very tough, obviously, during these first few years, but however she felt, Betty never once wavered in her dedication or Catholic duty to support her husband, whatever he chose to do. And this continued when Dan decided that after medical school, instead of getting a job, he would then immediately, without ever training or working as an actual doctor, go to law school so that he could become a medical malpractice lawyer. Betty again stayed true to Dan and worked to support the family for 3 more years while he went through law school. In total, Betty supported the family for 4 years while Dan studied full-time until finally, in 1973, Dan graduated and began working for a law firm. Now, I do want to call out that also at this time, Betty suffered at least 1 miscarriage. So they were still trying to have more kids. Her body was going through all of this trauma, her, emotional trauma of losing a baby, having 2 young kids. This, to be fair, is a lot. And I think this part of the story that I'm really focusing on right now is why she's viewed the way that she is later on. And it's not completely unfair. I will admit it's this part of the story you feel for Betty. From here, after Dan graduated and began working for a law firm, the family moved to La Jolla, California, which is a very affluent suburb of San Diego. While they were here, they had their last 2 kids and quickly began living a very high-end lifestyle. By 1980, Dan was making $1 million a year, which at that time was a fuck ton of money. And Betty, having, feeling as though she had earned it, which I agree. She worked her ass off while he went to school, made sure she was always decked out in the most high-end designer fashions, finally achieving the lifestyle she worked so hard for, and like I said, the one she knew she deserved. Because it was how she was raised, after all. Now, their 4 children were also super well taken care of. They were in all sorts of sports, music lessons, and the family was well known among the most influential social circles in the area. So from the outside looking in, they were the perfect couple, the perfect family, the perfect life. Betty was a soccer coach, Boy Scout volunteer. She was on the PTA. She was just the perfect mom. And Dan was the handsome breadwinner, allowing the family to take lavish vacations, attend high-end parties, putting the kids in any and every extracurricular activity they wanted to, and being there anytime he could. However, there's always a however to these stories, or we wouldn't be here, right? So, however, the couple really wasn't very happy and fought very often, pretty much from the time that they were married until the day they got divorced, which does eventually happen. Now, beyond the obvious financial stressors from the beginning of their relationship, both Dan and Betty are die-hard narcissists, which is pretty intense. One narcissist in a relationship is quite enough, but both people, that is a recipe for disaster. There was no way this relationship was going to end up any way than how it does. Now, like I mentioned, Betty was pampered from a very young age, and despite her few years of struggling and working while Dan went to law school, for the most part, she had everything she wanted all the time. That was just a brief sort of, just a moment in time. It was not her normal life trajectory. It was just a detour. And I think being raised that way and being raised with those expectations really fucked her mind up, to be honest. And Dan was the same. Now, he wasn't used to having money, but he was raised to have women be submissive, right? And so from the moment they were married, Dan expected Betty to bend to his will, to work while he went to school, to have his babies, to do his laundry, all of those things simultaneously, in fact. So both were spoiled, and both also took advantage of each other and felt entitled to anything and everything they wanted, including each other's time and hard work, and from Betty to Dan, money, and from Dan to Betty, service. Their relationship ended up being more transactional than anything, as that was sort of, the limit of each of their emotional depths, from what I can tell. Like, if they only cared about what people could do for them, which they did, then this definitely included each other. And their personality flaws were far from the only thing wrong with this relationship. Like I said, Betty became pregnant with another baby, a boy who was born. It actually wasn't a miscarriage, I forgot. He was born and died very quickly after. And this really messed them both up. Like, it's easy for them to blame each other or themselves. It's just not a good thing. But again, because neither Betty nor Dan were emotionally mature in any way, nobody really ever dealt with this trauma or did anything to help move each other or themselves past it as a couple or as individuals. Now, another thing was that despite looking like the perfect couple, Betty and Dan actually spent very little time together, and this began while he was in school and never really changed, which totally makes sense. Like, when my dad went to law school, I barely saw him for those 3 years that he was going to school. So, and then to actually go to medical school first, then law school, and then work as a lawyer, like, the time you spend in school is just setting you up for how much you're going to work, right? So it's a lot of work and a lot of time. And then for Dan, when he finally graduated, he was making millions of dollars, but he was doing so, like I said, by working 60 plus hours a week, which meant very little time at home. So the two had very separate lives. And when they were together, they fought about anything and everything. It's like they had it all, but they just couldn't allow themselves to enjoy it. Betty was always the victim, and Dan was always too busy for his family. Now, going back in time just a little bit here, in 1978, Dan opened his own medical malpractice firm to great success. But again, this meant many, many hours building his clientele, working cases, doing everything to get the practice up and running. After a few years, it was very successful, and in the fall of 1982, Dan hired a new secretary. Here we go. This secretary, a then 22-year-old Dutch-American named Linda Calkina, I'm not sure, was model-level beautiful. Like, you see her and you think she's in movies, which is kind of what I said about Dan earlier. So they're a good match. Betty was also beautiful, obviously, I mentioned that. But at this time, she was also almost 40. And Dan's narcissism meant that he needed the latest and greatest version of everything, including his wife. Now, Dan was also 38 at this time, by the way. So Betty's 35? But Linda's 22. Linda was a pretty wild choice for a secretary, as it said she didn't even know how to type when he hired her. And her previous jobs included being a flight attendant. And yet, somehow, she got the job. Before Linda was hired by Dan, she was actually known in the area, and people would openly comment on how much she looked like Betty when Betty was young. Which to me isn't entirely true, but also isn't super far off either. They're both tall, thin, pretty, blonde. All the big boxes were ticked, and in a younger package to boot. Within a year of Linda being hired, Betty was sure Dan was having an affair. The two began fighting even more than normal, like knockdown, drag-out fights, yelling, screaming, the whole bit. And while they had always fought, it was starting to feel different to Betty, like Dan was finally getting closer and closer to being done with her. Which is fair. According to the kids, Betty would regularly threaten to leave Dan. She would throw things at him, just act completely crazy anytime they fought. So it's fair for him to eventually, get over that. Betty wasn't the only person who suspected something, by the way, as Dan and Linda weren't exactly careful about things. Which, to me, that's another sign of Dan's narcissism. He felt he could get away with anything and didn't care who saw his actions because he was doing what he wanted. And in his mind, what he wanted and what he deserved were one and the same. Now, I think that could definitely also be true for Betty. But I want to point out, I think that most of the time, I don't know. Often I think when this case gets covered, it's covered with one feeling or another, like there's always a side. And I have a side for sure, but I also wanted to really try to be as fair and balanced and as much of a hater toward both of these people, apparently, as I could be. But honestly, like, I think they both had some really big personality flaws that contributed to everything, that happens. Now, it's very possible that Betty's suspicions actually came from some of their shared friends, as this was basically an open secret. And as you can imagine, Betty was not happy about it at all. Not just because she didn't want to lose Dan, but probably because she didn't want to lose her lifestyle, and she just didn't want to lose to another woman, period. In a Hail Mary attempt to fix their marriage, or at least start the process, Betty went to Dan's office on his birthday in November of 1984. Now, remember, he hired Linda in 1982, so we're 2 years in to whatever's going on. So Betty shows up, she's brought Dan flowers, she's come by his office to take him to lunch, but when she arrives, he's not there. Instead, there's evidence that a celebration has already taken place with an empty wine bottle and 2 glasses in Dan's office, and Dan and Linda nowhere to be found. In fact, Dan didn't come home that night, so instead of celebrating, Betty took all of his clothing and belongings, dumped them on the lawn, and set them on fire. She did this in front of her children. So whatever you say about Betty, she did not fuck around one bit. Now, after this, everything came out. While Dan continued to try to deny it, the affair was all but confirmed, and things fell apart entirely. By February of 1985, just 4 months later, Dan had filed for divorce and moved into a new place with Linda. Meanwhile, Betty was losing her shit in a major way and acting like a complete fool because, as always, Betty was the victim. And I'm not saying what Dan did was okay, and Linda was culpable too, for sure, but I just think everybody here sucks, like, truly. Of course, Betty started using their children as weapons against Dan, which I'll explain. But meanwhile, she was doing everything she could to garner sympathy from their shared friends and community. See, Dan left Betty in their old house and left the children there as well, at least at first. Betty, who did not work and was receiving money monthly from Dan despite the impending divorce, decided she would punish Dan by dropping the children off with him one by one, making him take care of them. Because to her, that was a punishment. Let him and his bimbo, which she loved to call Linda, deal with them, basically. Because kids are only a burden, right? They just get in the way of living your real life. I mean, that's how Betty felt about it, and fuck her. Which I want to stop here and comment on how funny it is that, again, while trying to play the victim, she blames her upbringing for this misfortune, right? I was raised to be a mother and a housewife by my strict parents. If that were true, the kids would have been the most important thing here and would have always come first. And yet, here they are being used as pawns and as a punishment instead of being protected and loved while their parents separate. And the way she did this was also super narcissistic and terrible as well, of course. Now, when she dropped the kids off, she started by leaving Kim on Dan's doorstep after Kim asked Betty to take her friend home from somewhere. That's literally all it took. And there are interviews with Kim where she recounts this situation. Apparently, this request was too much to handle, and Betty freaked out, screamed at Kim, and dumped her on Dan's door, leaving her there alone because Dan and Linda were not home at the time and didn't know she was coming. And also, no cell phones. Kim ended up waiting for hours until Dan finally came home and let her inside. Betty then went down the line, one after one with the kids, always finding some excuse to leave them with Dan, until finally they all lived primarily with him, though of course they also, spent time with Betty because how else would she legitimize getting a monthly payment from Dan for her living expenses? So Betty was a major asshole at this time, taking it out on her kids and just being abusive and crazy. And remember, Dan is a lawyer, and he used this against her later in their court case as a way of getting full custody of the children with Linda's full support. Because while Linda was only 7 years older than Kim, she was seen very quickly as a supportive kind of mother figure in the children's lives. She was super, maybe more like a big sister, at least to the girls, because she was closer in age to them. But to the younger boys, she was definitely later seen as a mother figure, which I think also drove Betty nuts. Anyway, so I'm going to switch to kind of going back and forth, just kind of talking about everything that happens, because after this divorce is put in motion, shit goes crazy. Shit just completely fucking hits the fan, right? As you can imagine. Now, if you know the story, you probably, like I said, know one version of it or the other. On the one hand, Betty is often painted as a heroic figure for women who are just fed up and have had enough of their lying, cheating husbands who leave them for younger women. And so I think a lot of what she does during this divorce is seen as understandable. People are sort of sympathetic or even like empathetic towards her, kind of saying like, well, I'd probably have done the same thing. Like Dan is really painted in this particular light. But to be sure, Betty got pretty fucking wild in the months and years while their divorce was taking place and after their divorce was finalized. Now, for example, she spray painted horrible things on the walls of Dan's new home. And while she was arrested for this, she spent only a few days in prison and had a temporary restraining order against her, which she promptly ignored with no repercussions. She would call their house daily, weekly, for months and years, even after their divorce was finalized, leaving the most like horrific, like awful messages. She was calling Linda a cunt. They were just horrible messages. And like her children would hear these, right? And she didn't give a shit because she just wanted Dan and Linda to hear them. She just wanted them to know how much she hated them. So again, no regard for her children whatsoever. And in fact, there was one instance where her 7-year-old son, Rhett, picked up the phone and begged her to stop calling and leaving messages with bad words on them, because if she didn't stop, he wouldn't be able to see her anymore. In response, while still being recorded, and yes, you can find this online, she talked to her then 7-year-old son about how his dad was was fucking some, quote, office cunt, and actually called Linda a cunt twice in less than 10 seconds, while just continuing to go on her tirade as if she were speaking to another adult, not her own young son. She ended the call by saying she was going to call the police to come beat up Daddy before hanging up on her poor, crying child. What a fucking asshole. She would also show up at the couple's home randomly, screaming and threatening things, and at one point, she ran her Suburban into the front door of the house, destroying a large part of it. Now, her children were in the home at that time, and she could have killed them easily, but did not seem to give one single shit about that, because she's the fucking mom of the year over here. So from Betty, we have all this fucked up, horrible behavior, and she clearly doesn't care about her kids at all, like not their feelings or their lives, like they're just not a factor whatsoever. And Dan did what he could, to keep her away, including having her arrested, having her committed, and getting a restraining order against her, which, like I said, she repeatedly violated. Now, the car incident is actually what led to Betty losing custody of her kids, which apparently she was very upset about, despite dropping them off with Dan prior to this. That also landed her a 72-hour hold in a mental health clinic, but once she was out, she went right back to her shit. So, there's Betty. There she is, in a nutshell. I'll bring up some more stuff too. And I do want to say, this is crazy, that at some point she ended up getting a boyfriend, which is so wild, as she's clearly obsessed with Dan and Linda, but it makes me wonder why and what kept her going for so many years at this level of crazy. Like, it's obviously more about her pride than anything. I mean, she didn't have any kids to think about. She had a big house. She was still getting over $9,000 in monthly payments from Dan. She had nice clothes, a social life, a boyfriend, and she chose to behave this way because she had to win, whatever the fuck that looks like, against Dan and Linda. However, as it turns out, dear old Dan wasn't just a simple victim. I mean, the way this whole thing started was with a nearly 2 years long affair, which he was extremely brazen about. And Linda, for her part, knew of and had repeatedly met Betty as she worked at Dan's office. So it's not like she didn't know that she was the other woman, which is pretty fucking shitty. Now, that being said, that's not really enough to justify Betty's rage for as long as it went on, but it's not all the couple did either. Now, Dan, because he was also a narcissist and therefore wanted to punish Betty for calling him out for his terrible behavior, would antagonize Betty to no end, sending her mailers and coupons for skincare, weight loss treatment, and other things to let her know that he and Linda both thought that she was old and ugly. Which is especially harsh since Linda was, 25 at this point? Now, according to Betty, so take this as you will, Linda also sent her photos of herself with Dan with taunting messages like "eat your heart out, bitch," scribbled on the back. Now, whether or not this is true, there are definitely other things that are true. Like Dan selling the family home without Betty's approval, using some weird legal loophole he of course knew about to allow himself to sell it without her knowledge or permission. He also fought her for full custody of the kids and would withhold letting her see them if she said or did mean things to him or Linda, which is equally shitty. Like, they both use their kids as pawns, and it's fucking gross. Now, Dan did buy Betty a house for $650,000, which back then was a whole lot of money. But he did this because he was required to by law, and it was part of his selling their family home out from underneath her. Like I said, he did also have to pay her the $9,000 per month in alimony, but he would do things like fine her for her transgressions, like if she left a nasty message on his voicemail, if she came to his house unannounced, took the kids without his knowledge. It would be like $100 per swear word, $250 for coming on property, and $1,000 for taking the kids without his permission. Which again, like, if he has full custody and she only has visitation rights and not even that for a while, like, call the cops or call Child Protective Services if she's taking them without permission. Like, do the right thing. Don't withhold money from her. And also he's doing it in a way where he's like, you are going to listen to me. He's making her submissive, just like he did in their marriage. Like, if you take the kids without my saying, okay, I'm going to punish you. If you call me when I don't want you to, I'm going to punish you. Now, was Betty being a total fucking psycho? Yes. But was Dan antagonizing her and being like domineering and trying to just have control? Also, yes. Like I said, everybody sucks. Everybody sucks. And again, the withholding of money, that's all that matters to either one of them. He cares about money. She cares about money. It's money, status, getting their way. That's how they both operated. And probably Linda too, especially based on the accusations made against her by Betty of sending those ads and the things in the mail. Now, anyway, as you can imagine, Dan and Linda eventually got engaged. And when they planned to marry, Linda begged Dan to wear a bulletproof vest to the wedding. She was legitimately scared that Betty would try to kill him at their wedding, which is really fucking crazy. Like, to get to that point is wild. But to be fair, she was harassing them daily for years, and she had threatened to kill them more than once. So, not totally unfair for her to request this. Dan did not comply, however, and believe it or not, they were married in their own backyard without any issues. Now, they did hire security just in case Betty tried to crash the wedding, but apparently she never showed up, which is honestly pretty surprising. Their wedding, like I said, was in their backyard in La Jolla, and it was a beautiful affair. To their friends and families, they were the perfect couple. Happy, fun, in love, just like Dan and Betty had seemed for so long. But in this case, it actually seemed very real. The two went on a honeymoon to the Caribbean, and life seemed like it might actually start to get better for the newlyweds. But we all know better, right? Now, do you guys say Caribbean or Caribbean? I actually interchange them. Like, I'll use one time and one another. I think I'm more comfortable with Caribbean, though, because I'm asking this question, which means that I noticed how I said it. Anyway, just want to call that out because I'm sure some people also noticed it because I noticed stuff like that when I'm listening to podcasts. So sometimes I just like to name what we all noticed, the elephant in the room, as it were. Anyway, sorry. Okay, so the couple was married in April of 1989, and as soon as they came home, the issues continued. They just started right back up. Betty once again was calling the house nearly daily, leaving lewd messages for her entire family to hear. Dan, for his part, continued with the monetary punishments, threatened legal action, and actually employed one of his many lawyer friends to send Betty cease and desist type letters regarding her actions. The back and forth went on for months, until finally, on November 2nd, just a few days before Betty's 42nd birthday, she received a notice in the mail that put her over the edge. It was a legal notice from Dan and his lawyers threatening to charge Betty with criminal contempt if she did not stop leaving messages on his answering machine or stop calling their home. Now, to me, this seems like a totally fair request. And really, at this point, just let it go, right? They're married. They have the kids. You have a house. You've got a boyfriend. You've got money. Get a fucking life. Go on vacation. But Betty wasn't having any of it. She was the victim. She had been wronged. Until she made it right, she could not let it go. And that's why, 2 days later, in the middle of the night on Sunday night, November 5th, 1989, Betty took her car and drove from her home to Dan and Linda's not far away. She used her oldest daughter's key to get inside and crept upstairs to their bedroom. She entered their room and, according to Betty herself, took out her gun, which she somehow was able to legally purchase during all of this craziness, and shoots at the couple in their bed, quote, real fast, no hesitation. She shoots the gun multiple times. One shot goes into the bed frame, one into the wall, but all others hit their mark. Linda was shot once in the chest and once in the neck, with the bullet lodging itself in her brain. She died immediately. Dan, however, was only shot once in the back as the noise woke him up and he was trying to flee the shooting. The bullet went through his back, hitting and collapsing his lung and fracturing one rib. However, this was not an immediately fatal shot. And we know this because Betty later said she heard him say, as he attempted to dive under the bed, "Okay, you shot me. I'm dead." So, with that in mind, why did Dan ultimately die? Now, Betty, who later claimed not to remember anything at one point, admitted, and there was also evidence of this, that she had the presence of mind to pull the phone out of the wall so Dan could not call for help. She said she thought to herself, he's going to call the cops before I make it downstairs. And she didn't want that, so she removed his ability to call for help and left him to die on the floor halfway out of his own bed. I believe Betty then called her friend Diane and told her that she had shot at Dan. Diane then called Betty's boyfriend Brad around 7:30 a.m., and he then called their neighbor, who was a longtime friend of Dan's, and the two went to Dan and Linda's home to check on them. Now, they didn't immediately call the police because Betty hadn't made it sound particularly bad. Shot at Dan isn't exactly the same thing as shot and killed Linda and shot and left Dan to die, right? When they arrived at the home, the front door was unlocked and the couple were found dead inside their bedroom. I believe that at one point, Betty also called her daughter Lee and confessed what she had done to her as well. From there, Betty was promptly picked up by the police, confessed, and was arrested on suspicion of murder. 2 counts. And here is where it gets really weird and interesting on a human level even more, because we're going to talk about the trial. Now, as I noted, Betty was immediately seen by some as a villain, but also by others as a hero. To many, mostly rich white men, mostly richly white men. To many, mostly rich white men in her own community, she was the scorned, crazy ex-wife, driven to murder by jealousy over her ex-husband's newfound happiness. But to many of those men in her community's ex-wives, or maybe even current wives, and other women around her own age, she was seen as a hero. Someone who finally stood up and said, "Enough abuse, I won't take it anymore." Now, funny enough, a movie called She-Devil, starring Roseanne Barr, came out almost exactly 1 month after Betty murdered Dan and Linda. And it's about a first wife who is left for a younger, prettier woman by her narcissistic husband, and how this ex-wife goes about getting revenge on him. Now, the first thing she does in this movie is vandalize and destroy their shared home. Sound familiar? The next thing she does is drop off their 3 kids with him and his new wife to force them to care for them. It's honestly crazy how similar parts of the movie are to this case. And this movie was seen not only as a comedy, but Roseanne was definitely the hero, and her movie husband and his new wife were absolutely the villains. So, I mean, I don't know that anybody else has ever mentioned this, but I think the movie was a sign of the times and just really perfectly timed to get Betty a ton of sympathy from women nationwide. And even now, the division between hero and villain remains, and the discussion continues as to who was really at fault. Now, if you think about that show that came out a few years ago, Dirty John, the first season is basically this story, and it's definitely not called Dirty Betty, right? So even now, I think women often identify with Betty, despite her being a double murderer. But I also think a lot of that has to do with people not really knowing the specifics of her behavior. Many details of which came out at the trial. But I think people are quick to forget. This often isn't discussed in great detail, but I'm going to touch on it because I really want to drive this home. Now, Betty's behavior prior to and following the murders came to light quickly, with her kids telling police about her abusive behavior towards both Dan and all of them, even years before the couple divorced. Her oldest daughter, Kim, went on to say that Betty would threaten to divorce Dan constantly, and Kim got to the point where she begged her dad to see it through and to take her with him the day he left. Kim also recounted a story where she became pregnant at the age of 18, and instead of asking her mother for help, she went to Linda. Now, remember, I said Linda was like a mother figure or a bigger sister, at least, and I think this is proof of that. Now, Betty, of course, found out and publicly humiliated Kim, going as far as calling the mother of one of her female friends, so not even the boy who got her pregnant, to tell her about the pregnancy and abortion. She also wrote a letter to Linda's family telling them of Linda's role in the ordeal. Now, as a note, Betty herself had an abortion when Kim was just 4 years old. So this woman is just the biggest fucking hypocrite ever. But whatever, just more about how terrible she is, right? In court, again, Kim even testified that Betty would often tell her children she hated them. It also came out that although Betty had received the threatening letter from Dan's attorney a few days before the murders, she also received another letter from their legal team offering her what she said she always wanted: custody of the boys back. The couple's 2 daughters had already moved out of the house, but the boys were both still minors, and Betty used Dan taking them away as her excuse for everything she was doing. Because again, she's just using the kids with no regard for their feelings. Dan finally agreed on a trial basis to give Betty custody, hoping that this would get her to leave him alone. However, many people, myself included, believe that this is actually what truly set her off, not the legal threat against her. Because if Dan gave her custody, she no longer had any excuse to intervene in his and Linda's lives. And I think it is now abundantly clear that she wanted and needed that excuse, needed to be the victim, had to have a reason why it's Dan's fault that she was literally stalking, attacking, and abusing him 4 years on from their separation. Anyway, so much came out at the first trial. And yes, I did say first. The first trial began in October of 1990 and ended in a mistrial, with 10 jurors wanting her found guilty on 2 counts of murder and 2 jurors wanting her found guilty of 2 counts of manslaughter. Now, in this trial, her defense used the battered women syndrome to explain her erratic and violent behavior, citing Dan's punitive actions against her over the years, the affair, which lasted, at least a year or 2 before Betty realized what was going on, and really just vilified Dan and Linda. And it worked. And it worked in the trial, and it worked with the public. Prosecutors, after the mistrial, were like, nah, we're retrying this case. And of course they did. And again, in 1991, Betty went to trial. Now, a lot of this trial is online on YouTube, and Betty's testimony is really weird to watch. She confesses on the stand, but her words and her demeanor are very much distancing herself from the actual murder. She said she doesn't remember pulling the trigger and that the gun, quote, just went off. And she says this over and over. It just went off. It just went off. The gun went off. It's like, girl, you shot it at least 5 times. It doesn't just go off. The gun doesn't shoot itself, and it certainly doesn't shoot itself 5 times, and it certainly doesn't aim at other people. Anyway, she's crying. She's saying there are blank spots in her memory, because we all haven't heard that before. And she even says the reason the, quote, gun went off is because Dan and Linda woke up while she was in the room, and Linda yelled, "Call the police." So just no acceptance of any responsibility whatsoever. Now, most of the trial is honestly pretty boring, but you get the feeling that nobody liked Betty or was on her side at this point, which is funny because, again, the public is very split with a lot of people on her side, but even former friends called her materialistic, vain, and obsessed with winning against Dan. So anybody who really knew what was going on was like, fuck Betty, and I think that's fine. That being said, Dan's transgressions were also on display, but honestly, it was a lot harder this time to sell that she was a battered woman. I think not only because each trial is just different, but also the prosecution knew their play, so it was easier to tear that apart because Dan never actually, hurt her. He did cheat on her, but he also divorced her and, gave her a house and gave her money. Now, in the end, Betty ended up being found guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. She remained unrepentant throughout the trial and afterwards as well, focused solely on any narrative that made her the victim. And I'll say right now that for many years, I actually did think that she kind of was a victim. I thought what she did was awful, but not justified so much as understandable. I don't know, I don't want to sound like I'm okay with killing people because I'm not. But there are a lot of women who are on her side because they lived what they thought was a similar story to hers. But after really diving in on this case, I have completely changed my mind. Dan was a misogynist. He was shitty to Betty. He shouldn't have cheated, but she was clearly abusive, narcissistic, always threatening him, and did horrible things to him as well. And because she felt he was mistreating her by being at school and making her work, and then, being at the office and then being with somebody else, she figured that was enough of an excuse to murder him and his wife. And I just, while I get it, I don't think it's as cut and dry as Dan having a midlife crisis and trading Betty in for a newer model. I think that they could have stayed happily married, but as her daughter Kim put it, Betty could never admit that she had a happy life. First, she was unhappy with Dan for various reasons. Then she was unhappy because of Dan leaving her. I mean, she's just always the victim. Never happy. That's Betty in a nutshell. So Betty went to prison, and weirdly, she flourished. Prison guards, other prisoners, everybody really loved her. She was still denied parole several times due to her complete lack of remorse, but she had a sparkling record while in prison. It's so crazy to me, though. She very likely could have been released if she had just swallowed her pride and admitted what she did. Instead, she never changed her story. She never changed her outlook. She was always the victim. And in that refusal, that's kind of it, right? She was 78 years old when she died and wouldn't have been eligible for parole again until she was 84. So pretty much destined to die in prison. She had a parole hearing in 2010, so she would have had a good 16 years out had she been able to do it, and again in 2016. I believe all but one of her children were with her at her bedside when she died, and after her death, they came out and said their relationship with her was complicated, but ultimately, she was their mother. In fact, in that 2010 parole hearing, her daughter Lee asked the board to release her into her care, saying Betty could live with her and her family in Idaho. Now, weirdly, or not so weirdly probably, Kim also lives in Idaho, so it would have been a reunion of sorts, because actually Rhett also lives in Idaho in the same city as Kim, which is not far from Lee. So Betty would have been able to live out her final years surrounded by her children and grandchildren had she just been able to get past her narcissism. Now, Daniel, notice I didn't mention him, he was actually the only child to speak out against Betty's release in 2010 and is also the only child to still live in La Jolla. So I'm not really sure the deal there. But anyway, that's the story, crazy as it is. My mind has definitely been changed. Betty sucked as a person, and while I doubt she would have reoffended, her inability to take responsibility for this makes her not only deserving of her sentence, but also she could be a threat because she can clearly delude herself into believing she's the victim in literally any situation, even in one where she murders 2 people, including the father of her own children. So yeah, dirty Betty after all. So I guess that's it. This is me officially being back. I'll probably be doing every other week just to help keep my sanity and actually keep myself recording. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening, liking, rating, reviewing, reaching out to ask me where the hell I'm at. Like, thank you for holding me accountable. You guys are awesome. I'm definitely a little rusty. Hopefully the cadence on this was okay. If it wasn't, please don't tell me. I promise it'll get back to the way it was. If you liked it as is, great. I'll keep it up. But yeah. Thanks, everybody, for all of your support. I'll be back in a week or two with another case. I think I have a cold case coming. I'm just trying to... Oh, sorry, I sniffled into the mic. I'm just trying to get a little more info on it so it's not super short. If I can't do that, I'm actually thinking about doing like maybe a few cases in one. Just like cold cases that have been solved. Some of them, when they're so old, you can find, 10, 15 minutes worth of research content and information. But you can't really do the deep dive that I like to do when I'm doing cases. So we'll see. Got a couple things cooking. Either way, I'll be back soon. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, stay safe.